So I want you to picture a freezing forest in the Rhineland.
Right, we're talking, what, late 1842 here?
Exactly, late 1842. And just imagine a peasant, completely desperate to heat their home, walking through the trees.
Just trying to survive the winter.
Exactly. And they pick up a few dead, fallen branches right off the forest floor, which for centuries, that was totally normal. It was a customary right. The forest basically provided for the people.
Yeah, a shared resource.
Right. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a Prussian guard steps out, arrests this peasant, and literally charges them with theft.
Wow, just for fallen branches.
Just for fallen branches. Because suddenly those dead branches are considered strictly private property. Gathering them is now this massive crime against the state.
Which is such a massive shift in how the law operates.
It really is. And here's why we are starting with this story today. If you, as our listener, are looking for the exact spark that ignited, some of the most fiercely debated and world-altering political ideologies of the modern era, you actually won't find it in some grand philosophical treatise.
Right, or some bloody battlefield.
Exactly. You find it right there in these totally mundane, hyper-local bureaucratic laws about who owns a dead piece of wood.
It's wild to think about, because that specific legislative shift regarding firewood, it forced this young, fiercely idealistic journalist to confront a huge blind spot in his own worldview.
A complete reality check.
Yeah, exactly. He basically realized that all the abstract philosophy in the world, it couldn't explain why a state would criminalize poverty just to protect the profits of timber owners.
All right.
He realized he had to look at material reality.
And that transition, from abstract philosophy to material reality, that is our mission for this deep dive today. We are exploring the intellectual origin story of a figure whose very name just triggers immediate visceral reactions all over the world.
To say the least, yeah.
But we are doing something highly specific today. We are looking at the development of the young Karl Marx, but strictly through the primary sources found in Volume 1 of the MECW.
That's the Marx and Engels collected works, for anyone unfamiliar.
Right. And Volume 1 covers just his writings from 1835 to 1843. So we are looking at the student, the poet, the angry young journalist.
Long before the statues were cast or the banners were painted.
Exactly. Now, really quick, before we jump in, because this source material is obviously bound up in some intensely charged political history, we have to set a hard ground rule for this deep dive.
Yeah, a mandatory disclaimer here.
Right. We are fundamentally impartially reporting on these historical texts. We are never taking a political side, and we are definitely not endorsing the eventual political movements that arose, decades later.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Our objective today is purely historical and analytical.
Exactly. We just want to examine the mechanical development of a thinker's mind exactly as it was preserved in these specific early documents.
Which honestly is the only way to truly understand the intellectual architecture of the 19th century.
Right, you have to read the early stuff.
Yeah, because when you isolate Volume 1 of the MECW, you strip away all those retroactive assumptions we have today. We aren't dealing with a fully formed revolutionary here.
Not at all.
We are tracking a university student, a kid in Bonn and Berlin, who is bouncing between studying law, attempting to write these sweeping romantic poems.
Very bad poetry, by the way.
Extremely bad poetry, yes. And, he's obsessing over ancient Greek metaphysics. We get to observe this raw, kind of chaotic process of a mind trying to locate its own center of gravity.
So let's start tracking that process right at the very beginning of this volume. The year is 1835. He is 17 years old.
Just a teenager.
Right. And he's sitting for his final school-leaving examinations at the gymnasium in Trier.
Okay.
And we actually have a handwritten essay from this exam. It's titled, let me get it here, Reflections of a Young Man on the Choice of a Profession.
Which sounds like a very standard prompt.
Right. It's totally standard. Every 17-year-old ever is forced to write some version of, what I want to do with my life.
Yeah, the classic college application essay, basically.
Exactly. But the actual text of his response, it lays down this psychological baseline that is just deeply revealing.
It really is. It reveals a profound, almost overpowering idealism in him.
How so? What's the core argument he makes?
Well, the core thesis of this 1835 essay is that human beings cannot achieve true perfection or, fulfillment simply by striving for their own individual elevation.
Meaning just looking out for number one isn't enough.
Exactly. He argues that if a person works only for themselves, sure, they might become a famous scholar or a brilliant poet or a really wealthy merchant, but they will never be a genuinely great human being.
Wow, that's heavy for a 17-year-old.
Right. He writes that the only way to achieve greatness is to choose a profession that allows you to work for the universal, for the common good, and the ennoblement of humanity.
It's striking because it is so earnestly selfless, but also, you have to admit, it's a little bit grandiose.
Oh, totally.
I mean, I'm paraphrasing the text here, but he basically writes that if you choose a position in life where you can do the most for humanity, no burdens can bow you down because they are sacrifices for the benefit of all.
It's very dramatic.
Right. That isn't just a teenager trying to impress a grading teacher. That is like a foundational operating system being booted up in his brain.
And you mentioned the grading teacher, Johann Hugo Wittenbach. He actually graded this essay.
Oh, right. What did he say?
Well, he noted that while the essay was really rich in thought, the young writer had this tendency to lose himself in elaborate, picturesque expressions.
Basically telling him he was being too dramatic.
Yeah, a bit too flowery. But Wittenbach was an interesting figure himself. He was a liberal, slightly subversive headmaster who likely encouraged this kind of broad, humanistic thinking in his students.
Okay, so he's in an environment that fosters this stuff.
Exactly. But the crucial takeaway for us from this essay is what is missing.
Missing? What do you mean?
Well, think about what this guy becomes famous for later. In this 1835 essay, there is zero talk of class struggle.
Oh, right.
There's no critique of political economy, no materialism. It is pure Enlightenment-era humanism tinged with, German Romanticism.
Just a kid wanting to do good.
Exactly. The desire to radically alter society is there, but the methodology is entirely abstract.
So he graduates, he heads off to university, and then the volume drops us into this massive shift in his focus.
Huge pivot, yeah.
Because from 1839 to 1841, this young man who just declared his life's mission is to serve the immediate common good of humanity plunges himself into an exhaustive study of classical antiquity.
Ancient Greece.
Yes. We are talking about his notebooks on Epicurean philosophy and his doctoral dissertation, which is titled Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature.
Catchy title.
Very catchy. He spends years just meticulously excerpting Diogenes Laertius, Sextus Empiricus, Lucretius, Cicero.
He's basically obsessing over the post-Aristotelian schools of Greek thought.
But wait, hold on. This is where I have to push back a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
If his ultimate goal is to practically impact the 19th century world and elevate humanity, like he said in his essay, why on earth is he wasting his most formative university years obsessing over guys in togas arguing about atoms and the void from 2 millennia ago?
It does seem like a massive detour.
It totally does. To me, it feels like a modern political activist trying to solve, I don't know, climate change by deciding to write a dense thesis on 14th century alchemy.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Like, where is the utility in this? Why ancient Greece?
So the utility becomes clear when you understand the intellectual monopoly he was up against at the University of Berlin at that time.
What kind of monopoly?
Well, the academic and philosophical world of Prussia was entirely dominated by the ghost of one man, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Ah, Hegel, of course.
Right. Hegelianism was essentially the official philosophy of the Prussian state.
Okay, so what did that actually mean in practice?
Yeah. Well, Hegel's system was an absolute idealism. It was this belief that reality is fundamentally shaped by the progression of a world spirit, or the idea moving through history toward rational perfection.
World spirit, so it's very abstract.
Extremely abstract. In this view, physical matter, the tangible everyday world, was almost a secondary byproduct of this unfolding conceptual spirit.
Wait, so if everything is just the world spirit unfolding perfectly according to its own logic, that creates a very convenient justification for whoever is currently in charge.
Exactly. You've hit the exact friction point there.
Because the Prussian monarchy can just turn around and say, hey, we are the ultimate rational conclusion of the world spirit, so, don't question us, we're meant to be here.
Precisely. It was a philosophy that, in the hands of the state, inherently discouraged radical change. And Hegel, in his massive histories of philosophy, had largely dismissed the ancient Greek materialists.
You mean guys like Democritus and Epicurus?
Yes. Thinkers who argued that the universe is made entirely of physical atoms colliding in a void with no guiding divine spirit at all.
Totally opposite to Hegel.
Exactly. Hegel treated them with a degree of scorn, He viewed their materialism as this primitive, lower stage of philosophical development compared to the high idealism of Plato, Aristotle, and obviously himself.
Okay, so by choosing to write his doctoral dissertation specifically on Epicurus and Democritus, this young student is basically staging a highly calculated, stealthy academic rebellion.
Exactly. It's an inside job. He is intentionally reviving the specific philosophers the dominant Hegelian system tried to bury.
Wow, so he is using the ancients to mount a critique of his present day.
Yes, but his dissertation isn't just a summary of these two ancient materialists. It's an incredibly sharp analysis of the difference between them, which is really where his own unique philosophy begins to emerge.
So what was the difference? Because they were both materialists, right?
Right, they both believed everything was just atoms. But Democritus believed in a strict, mechanistic determinism. He thought atoms fall through the void in straight lines, bound by absolute physical necessity.
Meaning everything happens exactly as it must happen.
Yes. If everything is just atoms falling predictably, there is zero room for human free will. Everything is totally predetermined.
Which frankly sounds just as suffocating as a world spirit dictating history.
Exactly.
I mean, whether you are trapped by physical gravity or an absolute spirit, you are still trapped. You can't change anything.
Precisely the problem he identified. And this is exactly why he elevates Epicurus over Democritus. Epicurus introduced this concept called the Klinemen, or the Swerve.
The swerve, like the atoms change direction.
Yes. Epicurus argued that as atoms fall through the void, they occasionally randomly swerve off their straight paths and collide with each other.
So they break the rules of determinism?
Yes. They rebel against gravity, basically. And for the young thinker writing this dissertation, that atomic swerve is not just some quirky bit of ancient physics.
What does he think it is?
He sees it as the philosophical foundation for human freedom and self-consciousness. He argues that Epicurus's swerve represents the principle of self-determination, the ability to break away from blind necessity and actually assert independent agency.
Oh, I see.
He is using Epicurean physics to build a case that human beings are not just passive subjects being dragged along by Hegelian historical destiny or by crude physical determinism.
Right. He's saying we have the capacity to act, to
Yeah.
push back, to actually shape our own reality.
Exactly. So the dissertation is essentially this incredibly dense academic defense of radical human agency.
That makes so much sense now. And it also explains the intense atheism that permeates these early texts in Volume 1, right?
Oh, definitely.
Because in the foreword to his dissertation, he actually adopts the battle cry of Prometheus from Greek mythology. He literally writes in simple words, "I hate the pack of gods."
It's very defiant.
Yeah, but why the focus on atheism here?
Because by rejecting the divine, or the spiritual, or the Hegelian world spirit, he clears the board.
He empties the room.
Exactly. If there are no gods pulling the strings and no absolute spirit unfolding in the background, all that is left is material reality and human beings acting within it.
Right.
So atheism, for him at this stage, isn't just about, rejecting religion just to be edgy. It is a necessary philosophical step to establish the absolute sovereignty of human self-consciousness.
Okay, so he is laying the intellectual bedrock here. He has established that the physical world is what matters and that humans have the agency to change it.
Right.
But once you realize that, you can't just sit in a university library writing about ancient Greeks anymore, right?
Oh, you have to actually do something.
Exactly. You have to actually go out and engage with the material world. The philosophy has to get its hands dirty.
Which brings us nicely to the year 1842. The academic path is effectively closed to him anyway by this point.
Why was it closed?
Well, partly because his mentor, Bruno Bauer, was actually dismissed from his university post because of his radical atheism.
Oh, wow. Guilt by association, basically.
Exactly. The Prussian state wasn't going to hire Bauer's radical protege to teach. So the young philosopher turns to the only arena left where his ideas can actively collide with reality, and that's journalism.
Journalism as a battlefield.
Yes.
And his very first major offensive, which is documented here in this volume, is a piece titled Comments on the Latest Prussian Censorship Instruction.
Such an important text.
It really is. Like, if you want to understand the mechanics of how absolute authority maintains itself, this text is an absolute masterclass.
Yeah, let's set the stage for this one. The Prussian state, under King Friedrich William IV, had just issued new instructions regarding press censorship.
And on the surface, they tried to make it sound good.
Right. On the surface, the state claimed it was actually liberalizing the press. They were supposedly easing restrictions to allow for more open discussion.
But then when you actually read the text of the censorship laws that he analyzes in the article, it is entirely Orwellian doublespeak.
Complete doublespeak.
I mean, the law literally states that writers are free to search for the truth, but they must do so with, and I quote, a serious and modest tone.
A modest tone.
Right. And it explicitly forbids any writing that attacks the fundamental principles of religion or the state, or that shows a lack of respect for the government.
So he immediately recognizes the trap here.
Yeah.
Because how can you genuinely investigate the truth of a political system if the law dictates in advance that your tone must be modest and your conclusions cannot challenge the state?
You can't. It's rigged.
Exactly. So he writes this searing critique, dissecting the hypocrisy. He argues that truth isn't always modest. Sometimes truth is sharp and loud and inherently disruptive.
Right.
By demanding a modest tone, the state isn't protecting truth at all. It is protecting itself from being effectively criticized.
He actually makes this brilliant analogy in the text. He compares the state's demand for a modest tone to a doctor telling a patient they are free to heal, but only if they don't use any bitter medicine.
It's a great analogy.
It's so good. It's like fighting against an opaque social media algorithm today, right? Where the rules of what gets suppressed are super vague, except the stakes here were the absolute power of the Prussian monarchist state.
Yeah, a slightly higher stakes game.
Just a bit. And he points out that these censorship laws act like a mirror reflecting the state's own insecurity. I mean, if the Prussian government is truly the rational, perfect realization of the world spirit that the Hegelians claim it is, why is it so terrified of a few newspaper articles?
That is the pivotal realization in this text. This is a major milestone for him.
Why is it such a milestone?
Because for the first time, he isn't just debating general philosophy. He is analyzing a specific political phenomenon. By exposing the irrationality of the censorship instructions, he deduces that the state apparatus is fundamentally hostile to the freedom of its own citizens.
It isn't a benevolent guardian like it pretends to be.
No, it is an active oppressor. The illusion of the rational state begins to shatter for him right here.
And so he decides to push that fragile state to its breaking point. In May of 1842, he joins the staff of a newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung.
Yes.
And by October, at just 24 years old, he actually becomes its editor, which is incredibly young for that kind of role.
It is. And the Rheinische Zeitung is a fascinating entity in its own right.
Tell me about it. Who owned it?
It was originally founded in Cologne by a group of wealthy, liberal businessmen, basically the Rhenish bourgeoisie.
Okay, so rich business guys.
Yeah. And they were frustrated with the rigid conservatism of the Prussian monarchy, particularly because it was hindering economic development and trade in the Rhineland.
Right, bad for business.
Exactly. They wanted a newspaper that would politely advocate for moderate liberal reforms. They basically wanted to rock the boat just enough to secure better trade conditions, but not enough to capsize it.
That makes sense. So they hired a brilliant young philosopher hoping he would give their moderate demands some intellectual prestige, right?
Right, but instead he completely hijacked their newspaper.
He really did. He executed this brilliant extended tactical maneuver.
Oh, he had to display immense skill here.
Yeah, because when he took over as editor, he didn't just have to fight the government censors who were reading his drafts every single day. He also had to constantly outmaneuver the moderate opposition on his own editorial board.
And he had to calm down the terrified shareholders who were paying the printing costs.
Exactly. You can actually read the tension in the letters from this volume. He is managing a total high-wire act. He's using incredibly sophisticated, complex language to sneak radical democratic critiques past the censors, while simultaneously telling the wealthy owners, hey, don't worry, the paper isn't going to get shut down.
Which is quite the balancing act.
It's amazing. He essentially converted a polite liberal business journal into a militant, revolutionary, democratic megaphone.
And it worked. Under his editorship, the paper's circulation doubled.
Wow, really?
Yeah. The public responded to his aggressive, uncompromising critiques of political and spiritual oppression.
Yeah.
But, it was the specific subject matter he chose to cover during this editorial stint that triggered the most profound ideological shift of his life.
And this brings us back to the freezing forest and the deadwood that we talked about in the intro. So, late 1842, the Rhineland had recently transitioned from French legal codes back under Prussian control, right?
Yes, that's the context.
And the local provincial assembly, which was called the Rhenish Diet, they were debating a new piece of legislation called the Law on Thefts of Wood.
Right. And to understand the magnitude of this, we really have to look at the mechanics of property law, transitioning from a feudal framework to a modern capitalist framework.
Okay, break that down for me. How did the old laws work?
Well, under the old customary laws, the forests were a complex web of shared rights. Timber owners owned the actual trees, obviously, but the peasantry had customary rights to use the forest for survival.
Like gathering food or wood.
Specifically, they had the right to gather dead, fallen branches for firewood. The rule was if the wood was still attached to the tree, it was the owner's property. But once it naturally fell to the earth, it basically returned to nature, and the poor were permitted to collect it.
So it was a totally vital survival mechanism for the destitute, especially in winter.
Exactly.
Mm.
But as the timber industry began to grow and industrialize, wood became a highly lucrative commodity.
Right.
So the forest owners looked at the peasants carrying away these dead branches, and suddenly they didn't see a traditional right of survival anymore. They saw lost profit, they saw their commodity walking out of the woods.
Oh, wow. So what did they do?
The wealthy forest owners used their influence in the Rhenish Diet to pass a law reclassifying the gathering of fallen wood as theft. They legally erased a centuries-old customary right overnight, transforming an act of survival into a crime.
That is brutal.
And it gets worse. The law even stipulated that the fines extracted from the peasants wouldn't go to the state, but directly into the pockets of the forest owners.
Wait, really? The fine was paid to the private owner?
Yes, exactly.
That is just unbelievable. So when our young editor covers this debate for the Rheinische Zeitung, you can see in the text that his writing practically vibrates with outrage.
Oh, he is furious.
He realizes the absolute absurdity of the situation. He points out that the state is essentially claiming ownership over gravity and time. I mean, by making the falling of a branch a crime, the government is militarizing nature to serve the rich.
And this journalistic investigation, it fundamentally breaks his reliance on abstract philosophy.
How so?
Well, up until this point, he had been arguing for freedom of the press and rational governance as abstract ideals. Like, if we just argue well enough, the state will become rational.
Right, the Hegelian hangover.
Exactly. But when he looks at the wood theft laws, and shortly after, when he writes his justification of the correspondent from the Moselle.
Oh, right, where he investigates the crushing poverty of the wine-growing peasants in the Moselle Valley.
Yes. When he actually sees that destitution, the abstraction totally evaporates.
Because he sees that the state isn't just making a philosophical error, right? The state is executing a deliberate economic strategy. He realizes the government censors aren't suppressing the press because they misunderstand Hegel. They are suppressing the press to prevent journalists from exposing laws that criminalize the poor.
That is the exact mechanism of his intellectual pivot right there. He observes that the Rhenish Diet, the legislative body, is acting purely as an instrument to protect the material interests of the property-owning class against the propertyless class.
It's not neutral at all.
Not even a little bit. The state, the law, and the police are basically weapons wielded by the nobility and the emerging bourgeoisie to secure their own economic dominance.
Which is a devastating realization for someone who started out as an idealist just wanting to serve humanity.
Total paradigm shift.
It forces him to conclude that you cannot understand society or politics or law simply by studying ideas. You have to study who owns the forest. You have to study political economy.
And the primary sources confirm the gravity of this moment. Decades later, his lifelong collaborator, Friedrich Engels, actually wrote a letter confirming this.
Oh, really? What did Engels say?
Engels explicitly stated that it was the study of the law on thefts of wood and the investigation into the economic destitution of the Moselle peasants that prompted this young editor to abandon pure politics and philosophy and dedicate the rest of his life to the study of economic relations.
So the theft of wood was literally the catalyst that birthed his economic theory.
Exactly.
Which makes the next major text in Volume 1 incredibly ironic, if you think about it.
Oh, the communism article.
Yes, because right in the middle of these huge economic epiphanies in 1842, he is forced to write an article titled Communism and the Augsburg Allgemeine Zeitung.
Right, so a rival newspaper in Augsburg had accused the Rheinische Zeitung of flirting with communist ideas.
Why did they accuse them of that?
Largely because of his fierce defense of the impoverished propertyless classes in those wood theft articles.
Okay, so they call him a communist. And this is arguably the most famous political label in modern history, right? Forever attached to his name.
Okay.
And yet, when he addresses it here in this article for the very first time, he doesn't plant a flag or declare a revolution.
Not at all.
He basically writes, I don't actually know enough about this to have an opinion.
Which is hilarious in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also a profound display of intellectual rigor on his part.
How do you mean?
Well, you have to remember what communism meant in the 1840s. Communism and socialism were largely utopian movements in France and Germany at that time. Thinkers like Fourier or Proudhon, they were proposing these elaborate, often deeply impractical blueprints for perfect egalitarian societies.
Like starting little communes everywhere.
Right. They were making moral arguments against inequality. It was fueled by emotional outrage rather than any kind of scientific analysis of the economy.
I see. So in this article, he acknowledges that communism is a highly relevant contemporary issue, driven by the real suffering of the propertyless many. He sees it as a symptom of the brutal economic contradictions he just discovered in the Rhenish forests.
But he fundamentally rejects the utopian approach. He criticizes the practical experiments being attempted at the time as theoretically thin.
Right, because he argues that the immediate emotional adoption of communist ideas without a rigorous understanding of the underlying economic machinery is actually dangerous.
Exactly. He writes that he cannot grant these ideas any practical reality in their current form, but he demands they be subjected to profound theoretical analysis.
Meaning, we need to study this for real before we just start a movement.
Yes. He refuses to adopt a political identity based purely on sentiment. He recognizes that to actually change the material conditions of the poor, one must first painstakingly dismantle and map the entire structural reality of the global economy.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Massive.
So he is basically hitting the brakes on utopian fantasy so he can build a heavy-duty analytical engine. But, while he is doing this intense internal restructuring, the external world is starting to close in on him.
Yeah, time's running out.
Which brings us to 1843 and the inevitable clampdown by the Prussian authorities. Because obviously, you cannot utilize a major regional newspaper to expose the economic self-interest of the nobility and relentlessly mock the king's censorship laws without triggering a massive reaction.
No, the state's going to hit back.
Right. The revolutionary democratic tone of the Rheinische Zeitung provoked the fury of not just the government, but the rival conservative press, too. They constantly demanded the authorities take action against this radical upstart.
And you really see the pressure cooker environment in the final months of his editorship. It's documented in these frantic marginal notes and desperate letters in the volume.
Like the one to von Scheiper, right?
Yeah, we see texts like Renard's letter to Over-President von Scheiper. He is literally feeding arguments to the paper's nominal publisher, trying to negotiate with the provincial governor just to stave off closure.
He's fighting street by street, trying to exploit every legal loophole to keep the presses running.
And the government initially tried to just manage him. They used double censorship.
Double censorship? What is that?
They assigned special officials to read the proofs of the paper before publication, just to make sure nothing slipped through.
But he managed to outwit them, right?
Oh yeah, he used increasingly complex, multi-layered philosophical metaphors to critique the state. The censors were often just too confused to ban the articles.
That's amazing. But eventually, the authorities simply ran out of patience. I mean, the Prussian state operated on absolute power, and absolute power does not tolerate persistent humiliation.
Exactly. So the king's ministers finally issued a royal rescript. The decree was final. The Rheinische Zeitung published its last issue on March 31st, 1843, and was officially banned and closed.
Boom. The end of an era.
The end of this specific era of his life, yeah.
Right.
And effectively the end of the narrative arc captured in Volume 1 of the MECW.
Right.
Because he realizes that operating within the confines of the Prussian state is just impossible. The censorship is too rigid, the monarchy is too entrenched. So shortly after this, he leaves Germany for the intellectual exile of Paris, where his real study of political economy will truly begin.
Wow. When you step back and look at the sheer velocity of the intellectual transformation contained within this single volume, it is almost difficult to process.
It's staggering.
I mean, in the span of just 8 years, we watch a young mind entirely dismantle and rebuild its understanding of the universe.
And the trajectory is flawlessly documented in these pages. I mean, think about where he starts. He begins in 1835 with the abstract, romantic idealism of a schoolboy just wanting to serve humanity.
Then he moves into the university, and he utilizes ancient Epicurean physics to shatter Hegelian determinism, asserting this radical atheistic defense of human agency.
Right. Then he throws himself into journalism. He tries to weaponize that philosophy against the Prussian censors, only to discover that philosophical arguments cannot stop a state that is economically incentivized to oppress its people.
Which leads to that critical rupture we discussed, the wood theft laws. He watches the state turn nature into private property and criminalize the survival of the poor.
And that forces him to abandon pure philosophy. He has to acknowledge that economic class structure is the hidden engine driving all political and legal reality.
And finally, he encounters the raw, utopian idea of communism, completely rejects its emotional immaturity, and decides that the only path forward is a grueling, lifelong scientific analysis of political economy.
From the schoolhouse in Trier to the shuttered printing press in Cologne, he literally transitions from an idealist to a materialist, and from a liberal Democrat to the precipice of revolutionary socialism.
Volume 1 of the MECW captures the friction of a mind constantly colliding with reality and being forced to adapt. It really proves that his later, monumental theories were not conceived in a vacuum. They were hammered out in the messy, frustrating conflicts over censorship laws and stolen firewood.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a totally fascinating historical counterfactual to consider as we wrap up this deep dive today.
Oh, I like counterfactuals. What is it?
Well, based strictly on the mechanics of his development that we've traced today, consider the role the Prussian state played in creating its own eventual ideological nemesis.
That is a great point. If the Prussian censors had simply been a bit more lenient, if King Friedrich William IV had just tolerated the Rheinische Zeitung instead of outright banning it.
Right. Would this young philosopher have just remained a fiery but ultimately harmless liberal journalist?
It's very possible. By ruthlessly suppressing his abstract political critiques, the state basically forced him to look deeper. They pushed him into the harsh economic realities of the forests and the vineyards.
Exactly. In their desperation to silence a loud editor, the Prussian authorities might have accidentally forced him to uncover the economic blueprints that would eventually threaten the foundations of global capitalism.
It really is a stark reminder that heavy-handed suppression rarely extinguishes a brilliant mind. It usually just forces it to dig deeper into the explosive truth.
A perfect final thought to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.